Well, hi everyone. Welcome to our community conversation about environmental justice. This morning, we're kicking it off with our 3-day series for Earth Deserves More Than a Day with a conversation about the 10-year difference. And what is the difference? Well, we will learn more when we talk about how a number of our frontline communities of color are overburdened with overpollution, causing a 10-year difference in life expectancy. One of those communities is the one I live in, the beautiful Duwamish Valley in South Seattle. My name is Melina Rivera, and with me today are two powerful advocates, Paulina Lopez, Executive Director of the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, and James Rasmussen, Duwamish Tribal Member and Superfund Manager, who also works at DRCC. DRCC and my home are located in the Duwamish Valley, traditional territory of Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish tribe. And so I want to frame the conversation with a personal perspective about how I live and move through my community. I live in an industrial area of town. The last 12 years, my South Seattle neighborhood has experienced the changes of gentrification. The punk rock house with the sign that read, "Don't trifle with us," and its inhabitants are now gone. And townhomes with 6 to a dozen units per lot have popped up with more on the way. I have new sets of neighbors where I see more young children and young parents walking their dogs and taking their children for an outing down my alleyway. In fact, my alleyway serves more like a sidewalk as folks walk by with strollers and kids on bikes as we exchange pleasantries. My new neighbors are also homeless with different types of RVs and makeshift homes lining pockets of our streets, and a tiny home village with folks who care about the community as much as those with a fixed roof over their heads. What has not changed in my neighborhood are the toxic odors that I wake up to most mornings. Between the hours of 6 to 9 a.m. and later in the afternoon, the air is filled with a heavy diesel exhaust smell. I haven't been able to pinpoint where the smell comes from. It's hard to track air, but I can't have a cup of morning coffee on my front porch without regretting it, as a headache sets in with the longer exposure to that acrid smell. Industry is all around me, around my house, trains transporting all types of cargo, including open coal beds, the airport where we see small luxury airplanes and private jets land along with cargo airplanes, carrying the many things that people have shopped for online, and different types of factories and industries that employ hundreds that commute into my neighborhood for their industrial jobs. My experience is no different than many other people who live in or near industrial communities in Washington state. Whether in rural or urban areas, we experience firsthand the effects of pollution and climate change. As someone who lives near industry, I understand the importance of these jobs in our economy. I truly believe that industry and people can coexist and that industries can thrive without sacrificing the health of neighbors or neighborhoods. There are many industries that are creating greener jobs and pathways. Just look at all the solar panels on your next neighborhood walk. Yet on a daily basis, I'm reminded about the bad quality of air in my neighborhood. According to the Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map, created by the University of Washington and front and centered, with data that tracks environmental exposures like diesel emissions and environmental effects like proximity to hazardous waste sites, and socioeconomic factors like race and income, people in my zip code on average have a lifespan 10 years shorter than people living in wealthier neighborhoods located only 9 miles away. We live in the same city, but a decade of life divides us. Why should anyone experience a shorter life because of where they live? Can you imagine what you could do with an additional 10 years of life? I think about my changing community and the young generations that are growing up here. Folks have asked me, why can't I just move and live somewhere else? I pose that same question to them. Do they have the financial means to move, and why should I move when there are other families living here too? We live, work, and play here. We're growing and thriving. My neighborhood is small, but it's mighty. We may be surrounded by industry and freight traffic, but we still plant trees and grow gardens. We will continue to fight for clean air and make our community voices heard because we each have a vision and hold on to hope of what a more prosperous, cleaner neighborhood can look like. Communities like mine are fighting for healthier places to live and are advocating for more equitable and just policies because we experience firsthand the effects of pollution and climate change. We have a vision for a better future, and we know that it's within reach. James and Paulina, thank you for granting me the space to share a little bit about my neighborhood.
Melina, you don't need to have us here. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction that speaks a lot of the reality, and I completely resonated with you and completely agree in everything you said. We share exactly the same. I just live across from the other side in the river, that everything you described was exactly as we believe happens every day in our community. So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and also for your advocacy.
Thank you, Paulina.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely with Paulina. It was very wonderfully said. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Well, James and Paulina, thank you so much for joining us again. And, I'd like to really introduce you guys and learn a little bit about yourself. So, James, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourselves? What gets you pumped in the morning?
Coffee, actually. But I've been doing this work on the Duwamish River for probably closer now to 40 years. And the changes that I've seen, not only in the communities, but in the wildlife, in, even in the people, has been a positive change that we've seen. And it's because of a lot of work, and it's because of a lot of work that DRCC has done over the years, to make sure that the community understands what's happening to it, and then understands that there are things that can be done and that their voice actually matters. When I first started down in the valley, the things were just happening to the community. In other words, Seattle Public Utilities would come into a South Park Neighborhood Association meeting, and they would kind of just tell everybody, well, this is what we're going to do, and now there's a whole nother approach that they take. They want to know what the community actually thinks. And I think that by making sure that that community voice is heard more, it has given the community itself more value to themselves, and that they understand that, we can change some of these things. So that probably more than anything else gets me up in the morning. So I know that I can rely on a lot of people to be able to, work with me, and we work with them. And our style of outreach is definitely not the easiest, but I think it is one of the most effective, because what we do is listen to the community and raise their voice. And we don't tell them what to do. We ask them questions all the time, but we don't tell them what to do. So as we move through this, we understand that there are multiple layers of contamination and health issues in the valley. And now with COVID, even more in relief as far as that's concerned. It has been under the leadership of Paulina that we've pivoted to make sure that we're helping people with food, helping people with rent, and working to make the community still go out and take care of their community. And, we do that very safely in small groups and that type of thing, but we're still regularly doing community cleanups, and that also helps the community look and feel better. And, big wall paintings and murals that have gone up, and that all puts that pride back into that community. So with the person that actually made some of those changes would be Paulina. So I'd like her to talk about some of that as well.
Thank you, James. And I have also being very honored to work with you. And since I met you with the organization, Melina, to refer to your question, I have been involved with the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition for the past, I would say, at least 13 years. I started as a volunteer in the neighborhood when I moved to South Park, and what I always, because of the nature of who I have been growing up and always trying to bring social justice, and even when I was in Ecuador, where is my home country, I look for organizations that will be doing the work in the community where I live in. It wasn't too long that I realized that my house was near to a Superfund site, and I wanted to learn more about it. First, I thought it was a Superfund, but it was actually the completely opposite of the Superfund site. And I just reading yesterday an article that came from The Guardian, how neighborhoods that live next to a Superfund site tend to have shorter life expectancies, exactly what you were describing, Melina. So I started to be a volunteer, a concerned mother, and little by little, you know, at DRCC, I really trusted in the way that they were engaging with communities. So I wanted to give my skills as an interpreter, as a translator, and then I came to be a consultant. But then I got hired to start the Duwamish Valley Youth Corps, which is a program that you're very familiar with providing environmental justice work and highlights to our youth of color. So I've been the executive director for the past, it's 2 years now. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work in the neighborhood where I live in, but also to work with incredible community, a resilient community that has been going through a lot, environmental injustices, and to make sure that we are talking to those who are to be accountable in a way that will be bringing back the damage, not bringing back the damage, but bringing back and paying for what the damage they have created. And so I'm very, very honored to work with people like you.
Thank you, James and Paulina, for those wonderful introductions. Paulina, you touched based on, social justice and environmental injustices. For folks, who might be new to these terms, what do we mean with climate justice and environmental justice problems, and why is that important to BIPOC communities?
I'll give the first stab, and I know Paulina will be able to fill in anything that I don't hit. One of the things, this all comes from civil rights, that every human has the right to life, pursuing of happiness and everything else. Out of that, there's something called Title VI, and that's a federal law that says, if you do not do this, then we can take away all your federal funding. And so that's a pretty big thing. And environmental justice came out of all of those things. And the way EPA describes it is that people of color and lower income people should have, the same rights as far as, the processes and those type of things that go on. The kind of way we look at it, though, is the other way, in the way you said it. It's environmental injustice. In other words, it is the undue burden upon people of color and lower income people as far as contamination is concerned. And that's everything from, as you described, trucks, trains, pollution from the industries in the area, and the lack of access to parks and to the river itself. So all of those things are part of all of that. And when you talked about planting trees in the neighborhood, the reason you're planting trees is because we have a huge lack of tree canopy in South Park and Georgetown, or the Duwamish Valley. And so that's part of that environmental injustice that we talk about. And so, we work with the community to get out there, to plant those trees, to do those type of things. to make sure that, you know, we're working on the problem. And with that, I'll let Paulina go ahead as well, because she's very good at this.
James, I think you described it really well. Couple of things I will add. I think that the work of environmental justice, you know, like the main thing is those decisions to be driven by the community impacted and affected. So I think that is into the number one, right? How do we center those voices that have been directly impacted to be making decisions? No one should be making decisions for us. Anything about us should be with us and should be started with by us. So I think that's what describes the environmental, you know, justice movement. Also, of course, for all the reasons that James said, but the climate piece, as we have been describing it, is, you know, how do we also embed all the planning for all the effects that climate is going to bring? It's already bringing, right? So how do we plan? Because one more layer that you have to, when you were referencing, Melina, you know, the pollution in your neighborhood, the lack of access to park, the lack of access to healthy food, the everyday toxic smells that you have to do. But then also when you are thinking about the future, what's that gonna get exacerbated when flooding comes in, right? So our communities, for instance, are going to be suffering from sea level rise. So how are we planning for that on the injustices that we live? How is the community giving the opinion and bringing all those climate mitigation impacts that we're gonna have? Because we don't want, on top of everything that we already cumulatively go and suffer from, we don't want also add another layer of having, you know, contaminated waters into our neighborhoods, and also, you know, exacerbating our already polluted air. So we have to be discussing this as well as, you know, bringing it to the racial issue. There's no racial justice without climate justice. So we need to acknowledge that it has been racial discrimination for all this. There's not a coincidence that in our communities, the majority are people of color, and that we are suffering through all these environmental injustices.
Great. Thank you so much for providing that history and also, you know, that context about some of those environmental issues. You know, you talked about lack of access to fresh foods, you know, clean air issues, you know, among a number of other things. And I want to talk about some of the issues around EJ, right? Again, environmental justice issues, and how are they interconnected with other things? For example, do you have to be a self-described environmentalist, right, to get involved in environmental justice issues? Or, you know, are there other ways that you've been working with a community where it's not necessarily seen as environmental work, but it's very much connected to environmental justice? Can you explain a little bit of you know, how that intersection happens, how that interconnectedness happens with other issues that you've learned from the community?
One of the things that I learned early on was that a lot of people that I met in the environmental community considered me a community activist. And then when you talk to people in the community activist community, because of what we're working on, well, you're working in the environmental movement. And I was talking to somebody who'd been doing that work for a long time, and he almost yelled at me. He says, don't let anybody define who you are or what you are. And that stayed with me because it you know, there's all kinds of technical aspects of things that I do as the Superfund manager, and trying to communicate that to a community to make it easy for them to understand. And also the whole concept of the environmental movement itself and the lack of people of color in that movement is something that we've been trying to work on also for a long time. Some of our coalition partners have now partnered with youth organization that is mostly people of color, and they've gotten great success from that. It's like our Duwamish Valley Youth Corps, which was something that has given us an awful lot of opportunities for kids but also we learn from them. We learn from them. They're incredibly important, but that whole concept of community organizer, however you want to say it, yeah, that's part of the work we do because we have to. But it doesn't mean that we're not working in the environmental movement, because we are. We are kind of on the front line, and a lot of the Sierra Club and all of those type of things really need to realize that we are on that front line. We are the ones that are dealing with the problems that they're not really dealing with. And we've gotten a lot of work with organizations within Western Washington, like Washington Environmental Council, Puget Soundkeeper, and other groups that are now working with people of color and that type of thing. And I'm putting together agendas for the legislature and other things that actually come from that front line, from the people of color.
And exactly. And you know, Melina, when we live in a world that we live in right now, and specifically in our communities, right? Like, we cannot separate our health from housing, for example. Like, we cannot think in silos anymore. When we are talking about, you know, like the lack you refer at the beginning in your introduction, and how gentrified your community of Georgetown looks like compared to when you moved. So, you know, people, we are, you know, looking into that. How do we make sure that people are kept in place, even though they have been suffering from these impacts of pollution? But nobody should decide if they should move or not, except from themselves if they want to move on, right? But because making it so unaffordable, the prices, of course, people have to be pushed out. And on top of, like, how do we provide not only the affordable housing, but healthy housing? We know the many apartments in the community, for instance, like we have been working with our community leaders and liaisons, doing healthy home assessments. Many of our community members are still living in apartments that are not healthy for their lungs, you know, like, and this explains why asthma rates are the highest for our children in the whole Seattle area, and even in King County, because of course that you live in all these layers that I mentioned, access to pollution that you mentioned, you know, the lack of access to healthy environment. On top of it, you live in a place that is covering mold, covering pests, and you don't have healthy food coming in. So think about the pandemic, you know, that is exactly showing and how amplified what we do, pandemic impacting most people of color that are vulnerable in their health, because they are the ones who don't have access to health insurance, they don't have access to healthy food, and obviously the language access to understand what a pandemic means. So it's all these layers that makes our job never to be addressing one issue. Like right now, for instance, we've been working with EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, because they have a proposal to cut the committed cleanup that we already went through 2014 to a fully, and they already heard from community, what do we want to clean up? Well, this is not just about, you know, like, oh, well, looks like these carcinogenics are not as dangerous as we thought. It's not just about that. They heard from the community. They're asking community during a very tough time, which is a pandemic, and a big change, which will be 5 miles of not dredging, into the commitment they already had. Why do we need to make these changes? Why do we link it to the environmental issue, justice issue? Because you're asking a community that is already addressing basic needs, that an organization that has been working very close to respond to these basic needs, to be engaging community in a pandemic time, which is obviously very limited resources and very limited acts. However, we're doing it, but that is one more layer that we have to be addressing, you know, like, why would the Environmental Protection Agency be asking during an environmental just time to be making these changes?
Yes, thank you so much for that. You know, you touched based on the Duwamish River right? And I'd like to learn about the history about the river and how, how does it serve the current community? And what purpose does it have right now, like ecologically, right? Why are we fighting for this river right now? And I ask this, just as someone who may not necessarily know about the history of the river, and how it impacts us today, and, who uses the river. So if, maybe James, you could provide some context behind that.
So if we go back maybe 150 years, before any of the development and anything else, the Duwamish River and the whole watershed was interconnected in a lot of ways that it's not today. The Lake Washington had what was called the Black River, which connected the Duwamish, and where the White River and the Black River came together was where the Duwamish River started. And now, of course, the White River has been separated, and now it's the Green River that is the river that feeds the Duwamish River. And since we lowered Lake Washington, the Black River ceased to exist. And so what I look at as the history is this area used to be one of the richest wildlife areas on the West Coast. It was the largest mud flat that I know of on the West Coast. And which for my people, the Duwamish people, this was a place where you gathered everything that you needed for your life. And so as we move through looking at how has this changed over the years, a lot of changes have happened to the watershed because it also used to flood all the time. And so they put up dams on the Green River now so that it doesn't, and the river is diked along the edges, and all of that has kind of hurt the wildlife that's there. And then in the early 1900s, the whole idea for the city of Seattle was to make sure that we had an industrial area. If they wanted to be that big, important city that they wanted to be, they needed to have an industrial area. And so all these mud flats and everything else were filled in with garbage and trash and whatever anybody could find, which has also created a problem in itself. But even rubble from the San Francisco earthquake was brought up here in ballast on ships and just dumped. And then those same ships would bring timber back down to San Francisco to help build that city back. And all of those things have, for the city to actually create and to dredge and straighten the last 5 miles of the Duwamish River, actually was the last 15 miles, but when they straightened it, it became only 5 miles. And to really create some of these, this industrial area, which made the city of Seattle, as we know today, it's one of the wealthiest cities and most educated cities on the West Coast. That change, though, has kind of created, especially in the Duwamish Valley and the communities of Georgetown and South Park, when we first started working, the city and the county and everybody else, they looked at this area, well, this is an industrial area. And so they didn't pay much attention to the communities that were there. Well, that's changed now. But one of the things that we find from Superfund sites and pollution across the country is a lot of times when an industry moves in, the property around that industry is lowered in value. And a lot of times that's where communities of color will move in and create their community. In this case, it's exactly the opposite that happened. These communities were established. Georgetown had its city hall well before the city of Seattle had its city hall. And South Park was incredible neighborhood, you know, with the farms and everything else that actually helped start the Pike Place Market. And so when we look at this, it was the industries that moved in on the communities here. So that's something really important that people understand. We have generations of people that are living in Georgetown and in South Park and can tell that history to the people. And another interesting fact, obviously one of the largest industries still today on the Duwamish River is the Boeing Company. Well, when Bill Boeing, the young businessman who was just starting to build airplanes, wanted to create his factory, he was looking in the industrial area. It was an Italian farmer that sold him his property for $1. And that's how Boeing got its start. Boeing will never tell that story, but it is absolutely true that it was an Italian farmer that looked at the opportunity for, you know, jobs and industry and that type of thing and said, he needs to help this. So for next to nothing, selling Bill Boeing that first set of property where he started to make airplanes, and everything expanded from there. The history of the river also is important to understand that it is a living thing. It over the last 30 years, it hasn't been doing really well, but it is a living thing. It is made up of all kinds of different things, just like we are. We have bacteria in our stomach. We have all kinds of things that work together, you know, to make us alive. And the river has all of those things. And I mean, some of the story is obviously something we have to look at critically, but we also have to remember to look at the successes. When I first started so many years ago, you didn't see herons, you didn't see eagles, you didn't see otters, you didn't see any of the wildlife down there at all. Maybe some geese and ducks and things like that. But I'm happy to tell you that today, the Duwamish River, or the estuary, the Duwamish estuary, which is what it is, where salt water and fresh water meet, has more variety of wildlife than any other place in the city of Seattle. Magnuson Park, Arboretum, doesn't matter. There's more variety. And that's natural because it is the estuary and that's where wildlife are drawn to. And things are getting better. More habitat site, more access to the river, and those type of things are coming on their way. And also in the things that we have to be able to protect them and enhance them. And all of those things are happening now. But the river is still alive. It is very important, as far as I'm concerned, to make sure that people understand, number one, there is a river here in Seattle because most people don't even know it. They don't see it, you know. But the other part of it is it has its own beauty and its own way of looking at it. Yeah, there's a lot of industry along the river, but there's also some incredibly beautiful places as well. And some of those places are where the old river still is. And so,
with so much history, yeah. James, did you refer to the tribes as well? Like where, I think you were getting to that, how it got intact where the Duwamish tribe used to live?
Well, where the Longhouse and Cultural Center is today, on West Marginal Way, across the street from what is now known as Ha'apus Park, was where the last longhouse of the Duwamish people was. And it was when real estate agents were starting to open up West Seattle, because it was very difficult to get from Seattle to West Seattle because of the mudflats in the middle. You can't just go there. But they put we're starting to do streetcars going across what now is Spokane Street. And when they started that real estate development, they saw that there were Indian people there and they had to get rid of them. The last longhouses for the Duwamish tribe were burned to the ground. And where our longhouse is today, where we've come back and have a place to talk, that is where those longhouses were burned. And so the resilience of the river itself, the resilience of people working together on the river, but also the resilience of the people, the Duwamish people, that this is an important place to them, is also, we are doing better, we are healthier. And it's probably, you know, how do you define that synergy between the health of a river and a health of a people? Doesn't make sense right away, but to us, it makes perfect sense that there is a connection between us and the river. And so as we look forward, it's making those connections, understanding all of those levels of history that we talk about. And that's from you know, the geological history to the people's history to the different, why has South Park and Georgetown always been places where immigrants have come to the city? In the early days, starting with Italians and then Japanese farmers, and then, you know, now with a very large Hispanic, Vietnamese, Kumar, as well as East African. Why has this place always been that? And it's because it's always been welcoming to them.
And also because I think, James, as you really well said, is because the Duwamish is alive, you know, like Melina, just circling back in your question, this river has so much history to honor. And, you know, for our first ancestral people and all the history that came with it, but also how the wealth of the city that we live in has been bringing, and that's why it has caused us to bring all these impacts. But I think it's important that we know that still the river is alive, the habitat that is coming, diverse habitat, the multi generations of knowledge and wisdom through the river, and also nowadays many people fishing on the river, many people for you know, substance, for bringing a fish to the table, and others for recreation. But we work and we want to make sure that, you know, like, we always recognize that the river is alive. So therefore the fish are there, the clams are there, the shrimp are there, the birds are there, and they all live in harmony. But that's why it's important for us to bring the people and to bring the history to make sure this is going to work for everyone.
Several years ago, we came up with a campaign to talk about, you know, this concept and try to make it as simple as possible. And what we call it is a river for all. And just as you said, we recognize as the industries, you know, it's important to keep those industries and get them going, keep them going, but also that they clean up what they're doing and that they understand why that's important. And most of the industries along the river are doing that. But it's also a community, the communities around, so that the communities can thrive as well as the industries have. So that's 2 points, and to have a stool, you need the third, and that would be the wildlife itself. So that you have a place now that is not just an industrial area and looked at that way, but it's also looked at as a rich community and looked at as a place of incredible wildlife for the city. And that's what we call that river for all. That if, you know, that's what a river is. It's a place where people do all kinds of things. Some even go there to pray. And, you know, everybody is welcome, and that is important as we move forward and let more people know about what's going on in the Duwamish Valley.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James and Paulina, for that rich history. I will tell you, and you talked about the straightening of the river because it was not straight initially. And I like to garden, and mostly I like to water because that's like my zen. But part of watering plants is gardening. And I find seashells in my yard. I find marbles, and I also find small booze bottles. So whoever was living here, definitely threw those bottles out or left them there. And people say, oh, like your garden's so lush. And I essentially tell them, like, I can drop anything, a seed will grow here because there's the soil is naturally rich. You have all that wonderful again, all those wonderful minerals. And because it does come, and the seashells tell me that, this was a place, or at least my house, that was near the river, or may have been the river itself. I don't know that history yet, but I'm really excited to essentially have this conversation, because then it tells me, like, hey, I'm going to learn more about specifically, my neighborhood where I am. But, it really provides also a greater perspective about what that river means for the region, what it means to people outside of the Duwamish Valley. So thank you for that. And one of the things that you touched upon was like this intergenerational, justice, where we have future generations are among us who are going to be disproportionately impacted by the consequences, right, of climate change, or the decisions that prior generations have made. And I want to talk about, your Youth Corps program, and, how are they helping, like James said, improve the community, rebuild, and really, honor the place where we're in.
Of course. Thank you for bringing the youth up, Melina. As you know, specifically South Park has the highest number of youth in Seattle per capita, right? So we listen to the community when they prioritize and they say, there's not anything in this community to do for our youth. We need to create a youth programming. So we, back in 2014, started to address that and created our Duwamish Valley Youth Corps, which basically it's a program where our local youth of color learn about the community they live in, but they also learn about how to be advocates themselves, and like all the different things, the layers of advocacy that they need to do. It's a way to introducing them a little bit more of the knowledge and to the wisdom they already have, but to give them the tools to make a change and a positive contribution to the place where they live in. So since the creation, we have, I would say, touched the lives of about 1,000 youth in the neighborhoods. They are the ones who design the program. So they decide the project that they want to work in after they learn about the issues of the river, about the clean air, clean air program is what it's called, but no, definitely we don't have clean air. And so they will decide what type of actions they would take. They also learn about, like the lack of open space. So we brainstorm with them. So what would be some things that we can do to make a change? And we have seen an incredible connection, how they develop and how that ownership in the community and resilience has been developing within them. When we have been out planting trees, and we have since the beginning at least planted about more than 2,000 trees now with our partners, and then you hear a youth passing by and having that ownership. Oh, I planted a tree, Miss Paulina. I feel like every time I plant a tree is like leaving my heart in here and my soul. Hearing that from them really fills our hearts and really speaks of the mission of why the program is important, how they get to the sign, okay, so we have a problem with graffiti in the neighborhood. What do you think we should do? And having them design, what about if we put murals? What about if we, and so when they make themselves those changes, when they planted the tree, when they put a seed, when they painted a mural, that speaks of themselves beautifying the neighborhood, and then they would never damage. And that's what we wanted to make sure that, it's going to be the planning for them, how to care for the community they live in, how to advocate for the community they live in, and also how to be a contributor of this change and prioritize themselves. So we have had an incredible, wisdom from them. Right now, we are forming a leadership council. So we will be, as we are embarking with our climate justice work, we want to make sure that is their voices reflected in anything that we do, and is their decisions as we are planning for climate, right? Adaptation and mitigation. We can't talk about climate without talking with our younger voices, with our young future leaders. So we are completely excited about that. This will be the 6th year of the Youth Corps. We have one of our wonderful staff members. She is from the first cohort. She came when she participated, she was 15. Now, I think you know very well Maggie. So she, reflects exactly as we have been seeing, giving the power to those who are in the neighborhood. Maggie has been there since her whole life in South Park, but is giving those tools. And now she is driving these changes, driving many wonderful things to the community. So that speaks themselves with the program.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I have actually really enjoyed seeing all the programming that you do that benefit both, South Park and Georgetown and the river. So thank you. That's wonderful. I want to touch base too on, we know we're learning, how you engage with youth, but I also want to learn, for folks who are listening to this, how can people get involved in building solutions, right? What is one way that you've seen people come together for that? We've learned one way is that youth program. And also, what are some major policies or solutions that would help build, that would help communities that are overburdened with pollution?
Yeah, I'll try that. I think the most important thing, as I said before, is to make sure that we listen to the community itself. That, there are so many, either city or other things, they come in and they try to convince the community this is the best thing for them. And the community doesn't have a say in that. And we've got things now to the point where city, county, and all kinds of different people understand that they actually have to come in first and start asking questions and finding out answers and what the solutions are within that community. And that's the empowerment that happens. Now, we have other areas of our fair city that are in kind of the same type of situation, down in Rainier Valley and other places. And what I look at is that now organizations are there and they're doing the same type of work with them. And what I think people need to understand is that this affects everyone, not just those communities of color, but it affects everyone. And the more that they start learning about the processes, what's going on, even if it's just understanding what a Superfund site, which you can go to our website and it has a whole thing of being able to describe that to you. We actually do tours of the river, that we've been able to put together different videos and that type of thing. But it's important that everybody understand. And, it's kind of like what's happened over this last year or so with the Black Lives Matter movement is all of a sudden something changed. And all of a sudden, a lot of, not all white people, but a lot of white people started to understand, oh, this is the issue. And now I should get here and support these people. Well, it's the same thing with what we're doing in the Duwamish Valley and other organizations are doing in other parts of Seattle. And then as you go up the watershed, Kent, Auburn, Tukwila, and Renton, and all of those cities all have that rich history, all have communities of color within them. And it's making sure that the cities there understand that there is, you know, that these are not poor, dumb people. They actually probably know some of the solutions better than they do because they live there and they're affected by it more. So what I look at is to make sure that we look at how can we empower that community. One of the things that we've done with the Duwamish Valley Youth Corps is they do a presentation every year. And this presentation is almost soup to nuts, from climate change to environmental justice, to the Superfund site, and to all the things that are open space and other things that are connected to their community. And it's the kids that are doing the presentations. And we get a lot of people that come to that, not only because their parents know they have to come, but also because you're hearing it now from a fresh voice, and that they understand these things. And we have been lucky to have now the mayor come to this event every year, or Congress people, or from the state Congress and other things, to come and listen to the kids and then be able to speak to them about how impressed they are. And those kids get really nervous being able to do this, but once they've gone through it and done it, they feel like they can conquer the world. And I think that's one of the things, like with Maggie, she's been through these things. She's been able to talk to people about it, and she knows she understands it really well. And she is now one of the most, a very important part of our team because of her background.
Just piggybacking a little bit on what James just said, I think that is actually creating policy, right? When you have youth talking about healthy environment, when you have youth talking about what are best solutions for my own community, I think the importance of getting their voices are what matters. And with the elected officials coming, that's who they should be listening to directly, right? Like that's exactly the type of information they need to draft any legislation or any policies. I think as our organization has been also involved in the creation of bringing attention to the valley, we have created resolutions, as James said, and motions with the port, with the city, with King County, to make sure that we are keeping them accountable, that they are bringing what is needed for the community to be healthier. So a great example is how we were able to develop, after that motion and ask for a Duwamish Valley program in the city, that we work very close with. And so it's a bringing the attention of how do we use racial and equity tools? How do we use environmental justice embedded policies into all the work that you're doing? And you are bringing that attention to a community that has the highest impacts on environmentally speaking. And so how do we work along with the city to make these changes and creating these networks, right? Like, so we did develop together, after we did some prioritization as community. That is creating policies. When you are prioritizing what is important to me, when you are prioritizing goals and programs that are going to be directly coming to my community, that is creating policy. And so also, when we are trying to, right now we have a very robust clean air program, so we have been trying to bring those to the table. We have about I would say 45 partners into developing the best strategies, looking into root causes that are creating. Why does this let's say this person, like Sophia, has asthma? Oh, because she lives in an apartment with a lot of contamination or unhealthy apartment. Why does she live in an unhealthy apartment? Oh, because she cannot afford. Why she cannot afford? So we have been doing a lot of root cause analysis and trying to turn the curve into bringing strategies and policies that hopefully we will be able to come to the people who are responsible and say, here is what the community has developed, these strategies, these policies. You need to create what you need to make sure you have all the infrastructure and the system in place to make them happen.
we also did a very scientific study on air quality in the Duwamish Valley, and it was called the moss study. And what it does is takes the moss from trees and then, put that and then have that tested. And you can tell where the air pollution is maybe a little worse than it is in other places. The most important thing about that, and thank goodness for Western Washington University that helped with this and others, is that the youth were involved with that. And the youth were actually the ones going out and doing, collecting the moss and actually, being able to mark exactly where this moss came from and everything else so that, it could be tested correctly. And they actually had another group of people that were more university students that, were also studying this, and they went out and did the tests. There was no difference between what kids did and from what they did. And the kids actually got to get into the lab at the University of Washington and understand how the test was done. And then the presentation of the results of that was done by the Youth Corps. They were the ones that were telling people, what does this actually tell us? And we are going to continue with that program and do it even more to kind of have things change since we did the last one. Were there places that we didn't collect from that we might be able to collect from? And then that's where the kids start to get involved. Where should we collect those samples? And then that gives them, that power and that knowledge to move on.
Thank you so much for that. And you really highlighted how policies are created and how they're informed and rooted in community, and why it's important for legislators to listen to younger generation and youth advocates, and why it's really important to propel the empowerment of communities and youth. And so we're going to wrap up this segment, but before we do, I just very briefly, I asked, what gets you up in the morning? What is one of your biggest joys as we communicate all this wonderful work that DRCC is doing and other advocates are doing around climate justice and environmental justice? What is your biggest joys that you want to share around your advocacy and your efforts?
I'm going to start real quick to give Paulina the last word. I think we talk about policies and that type of thing. The collaboration that we've had with not only Front and Centered, but many other groups that kind of put forward the HEAL Act. And that I believe is already made it through our legislature. And for the first time, environmental justice is actually part of a law coming out of the legislature. And it's taken a long time to get there, but working together with all of the different groups that help support it and has made that difference. And I'm happy to say that that's something that we were part of. And, thank you as well for your work on that, because it was really carried a lot by Front and Centered, and I'm very proud to be a partner with Front and Centered.
Thank you, James. Yeah, that was great. And to add, I would say, there's so many things that keep me awake at night. But the most important, I think, is how are we going to make sure that really, truly, we are bringing a healthy environment, healthy water, and to all our, communities that have been impacted the most. How are we going to be facing our children and say, how much did you work truly to bring a different future, so I can either live longer or enjoy the place where I live. So it's it sounds like it's so far away, but it's those conversations that are starting right now, those actions that are happening, like the HELAC, like the recognition of the people saying, yes, we need to be addressing environmental justice. Yes, we need to be bringing better, stronger regulations for those who are polluting. We're not cutting corners anymore, but how are we truly, in the leadership and the those who are making the decisions, those who are polluting, those who need to be acting differently. How is it changing? How is this changing within them? So to be addressing those who have been the longest impacted. There is so much to do. There is not a lot of time, but I think I have to say, the more we have partnerships with the right people, the more that we are out there loud and clear, bringing those voices is going to help us get to the place that we need to be. As James has said, so many things have changed already, but we don't notice it because we are very busy attending the new things that keep on coming. So how do we create a stronger ties and relationship with those who really truly have the means of changing it, and as we are keeping our community healthy and resilient? Thank you, Melina.
Thank you both so much for our conversation and sharing your stories, and for your environmental justice leadership and restoring our community's ecosystem, our river, and ensuring that community voices are heard through that process. Stay tuned for the next set of programs this week. Earth Deserves More Than a Day, focus on environmental justice. We're having conversations, sharing stories and films, April 20th through the 22nd. The summit is in collaboration of Rainier Avenue Radio.World, Front and Centered, and Social Justice Film Institute. We're hosting multiple events via radio and film. So again, remember to tune in and find that schedule and links on www.rainieravenueradio.world. Watch on Rainier Avenue Radio Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and listen on the app and the website. Thank you so much for joining this conversation.